When time stopped feeling safe. Time is the one thing humans rarely question. We question leaders. We question gods. We question borders, laws, even reality itself. But time feels different. It feels permanent, untouchable, reliable in a way nothing else ever is. Every day follows the one before it. Morning comes after night. Years accumulate quietly, stacking memory upon memory, creating the comforting illusion that life moves forward along a stable path. We build everything on that assumption, our routines, our identities, our hopes for the future. We wake up believing that today is exactly where it should be in relation to yesterday. We trust that tomorrow will arrive on schedule. That age increases in predictable increments. That birthdays, anniversaries, seasons, and rituals will unfold in the order we expect. Time feels like the spine of reality, invisible but essential. So essential, in fact, that most people never stop to ask who defines it. And that is why, the moment it failed, or appeared to fail, struck so deeply. There was a day when thousands of people genuinely believed that time itself had broken. Not symbolically, not philosophically, literally. They believed that days had been stolen from their lives, that the calendar had jumped forward without their consent, that moments they were meant to live had simply vanished. And what made this moment so terrifying was not confusion. It was recognition. Recognition that time, the thing they trusted more than anything else, was not as solid as it seemed. Imagine waking up and being told that today is not the day you think it is, that several days no longer exist, that you are older than you remember being yesterday, that events you were waiting for, celebrations, rituals, obligations, have already passed without you experiencing them. Nothing about your body feels different. The sun rises the same way, the sky looks unchanged, and yet, reality insists that time has moved on without you. This was not a rumor spreading through a single town. It was not hysteria isolated to one group. It was a coordinated shift, imposed across societies, backed by authority, enforced by institutions, and justified as necessary. From the perspective of those in power, it was a correction. From the perspective of ordinary people, it felt like erasure. People reacted not with immediate chaos, but with stunned silence. A pause, a collective hesitation as minds struggled to process what words were telling them. They counted days on their fingers. They pointed to marked calendars. They argued quietly with family members, hoping someone else had misunderstood. But no one had. Days were gone, and something far more fragile than time disappeared with them. Trust. Time is not just a measurement, it is a promise that effort accumulates, that suffering leads somewhere, that memory is anchored to sequence, that life unfolds in a way that can be understood. When that promise breaks, the world feels unstable. People did not panic because they lost dates. They panicked because they lost continuity. They lost the assurance that their lives followed a coherent story. Children asked whether their birthdays had been taken. Workers wondered if they had lost wages. Religious communities questioned whether sacred days had been violated. Elderly people feared they were closer to death than they remembered being. Time became personal, and personal loss always feels real, even when it cannot be touched. Authorities attempted to reassure the public. They explained that time itself had not changed. Only the calendar, only the system of measurement. The sun had not moved differently. The earth had not skipped forward, but these explanations failed because humans do not experience time as astronomy. They experience it as lived experience. Memory does not care about technical corrections. It cares about sequence, about expectation, about anticipation. fulfilled, and anticipation, once broken, leaves behind grief. People mourned days they believed they had never lived, moments they could never recover, experiences erased not by nature, but by decision. This mourning was rarely acknowledged. Official records did not include grief. History books reduced the event to reform, alignment, modernization. But on the ground, among ordinary people, the emotional damage was profound. Because something deeply unsettling had been revealed. Time was not sacred, it was negotiable, and negotiable things can be taken. Once this realization settled in, fear grew quickly. If days could be removed, what else could be adjusted? If age could be recalculated overnight, what did that mean for identity? If sacred calendars could be overwritten, what authority remained unquestionable? People began to sense that time was no longer neutral. It was controlled, and control over time meant control over life. Daily routines became fragile, schedules felt provisional. The future felt uncertain in a way it had never felt before. People stopped assuming that tomorrow would resemble today closely enough to plan with confidence. Sleep patterns changed. Anxiety spread. Conversations returned again and again to the same topic, as if repetition might restore stability. What day is it really? That question, once trivial, became existential. Because when people cannot agree on the present, cooperation collapses. Shared reality fractures, trust erodes. Time, which once unified experience, began to divide it. Some accepted the change quickly, not because they understood it, but because resistance felt exhausting. Others refused, insisting that memory mattered more than decree. Still others oscillated between compliance and doubt, unsure which version of reality to trust. The world did not fall apart immediately, but it cracked, and cracks change everything. The day people believed time was broken exposed a truth that modern societies rarely confront. That much of what we call reality is built on agreement. We agree on borders, we agree on laws, we agree on money, and we agree on time. When that agreement is disrupted, even briefly, the illusion of permanence dissolves. People realize that time had always required belief to function. Calendars only work because we trust them. Clocks only matter because we obey them. Schedules only control behavior because we accept their authority. That day, for the first time, many people saw time not as a force of nature, but as a system. And systems reflect values. This realization did not immediately produce rebellion. It produced something quieter, more dangerous to stability. Doubt. Doubt that time was fair. Doubt that progress was inevitable. Doubt that life unfolded according to neutral rules. Once doubt enters the relationship between humans and time, it never fully leaves. It changes how people move through the world. They become cautious, skeptical, less willing to surrender experience to schedules, less willing to believe that speed equals success. They begin to ask questions that had once felt unnecessary. Who decides the rhythm of life? Who benefits when time accelerates? Who is punished when it does not? These questions did not have clear answers, but their existence mattered. Because the day people believed time was broken was not about calendars. It was about vulnerability. The vulnerability of a species that builds meaning on continuity, only to discover that continuity is fragile. It was about fear, not of chaos, but of arbitrariness. The fear that something fundamental could be changed without warning, without consent, without empathy. And once that fear takes hold, the world is never experienced the same way again. This is where the story truly begins, not with missing days, but with the moment humans realized that time, the thing they trusted to hold their lives together, could be rewritten. And if time could be rewritten, then nothing felt entirely safe. The missing days. No one could explain the shock did not explode immediately. It settled. It settled into kitchens, marketplaces, churches, and workshops as a heavy, uneasy silence. People did not rush into the streets screaming. They did not riot, at least not at first. Instead, they paused. They stared at calendars. They counted days aloud. They replayed recent memories, searching for proof that the world still made sense. At first, most assumed there had been a mistake, a printing error, a misunderstanding, a message that would soon be corrected. Someone somewhere must have gotten it wrong. But as the hours passed, the message did not change. Days had been removed. The calendar had been corrected. This was now the official time, and it applied to everyone. People gathered around tables and argued in low voices as if raising the volume might make the loss more real. They pointed at dates that had been carefully marked only days before. A wedding circled in ink, a feast day underlined, a birthday written in a child's handwriting. All of it now belonged to the past. Parents struggled to explain to their children why something they had been waiting for would never happen. How do you explain to a child that a day is gone? Not postponed, not canceled, gone. Children asked questions adults could not answer. Did it still count if we never lived it? Was I still supposed to grow older? Did God know the day was missing? These questions frightened adults more than they frightened children. Because adults realized they did not know either. Workers felt the loss differently. Wages were calculated by the day. Labor was measured in time. If days disappeared, had they been paid fairly? Had they worked for free without knowing it? Employers insisted the adjustment was accounted for. Workers were unconvinced. Time was money. And missing time felt like theft. Religious communities experienced the loss as something closer to sacrilege. Sacred calendars governed fasting, feasting, prayer, and rest. Holy days were not simply dates. They were obligations believed to carry spiritual weight. Now some of those days had been skipped entirely, gone without prayer, gone without preparation, gone without acknowledgement. Clergy debated fiercely behind closed doors. Some argued that intention mattered more than timing, that faith would not be punished for administrative change. Others insisted sacred time could not be altered by decree, that divine order existed beyond human calendars. Believers listened anxiously, desperate for reassurance. Because if time could be wrong, then ritual could be wrong. And if ritual could be wrong, then certainty collapsed. Elderly people felt the loss most quietly. They had lived long enough to understand how quickly life passed. Losing days felt like losing breath, like being pushed closer to the end without warning. Some counted their age repeatedly, recalculating. Others refused to acknowledge the new numbers. They insisted they were the same age they had been the day before. Because identity is bound to time, and identity does not change easily. Authorities responded with confidence rather than compassion. They repeated the same explanation everywhere. Time itself had not changed, only its measurement. The correction was necessary, scientific, rational. They did not understand why people were upset. From their perspective, nothing had been lost. From the public's perspective, everything had been shaken. The language used by officials only deepened resentment. Words like alignment, adjustment, and efficiency felt cold, detached, as if lived experience could be erased with terminology. People began to say the same sentence again and again. They stole time from us. This belief spread quickly. It did not require evidence. It required emotion. And emotion was abundant. Rumors followed. Some whispered that more days would be taken later, that years might be shortened, that lifespans were being quietly compressed, that the powerful would live longer while ordinary people aged faster. None of this was true. But fear does not require truth to spread. It requires uncertainty. And uncertainty was everywhere. People stopped trusting calendars entirely. They asked shopkeepers what day they believed it was. They asked neighbors. They compared answers. Disagreements sparked arguments. Arguments sparked suspicion. When people cannot agree on the present, cooperation becomes difficult. When cooperation breaks down, fear grows. Public spaces became tense. Markets were louder. Tempers were shorter. Minor disagreements escalated quickly. Everyone felt as though something essential had been taken, but no one could agree on how to get it back. Sleep suffered. People lay awake replaying the announcement in their minds. They tried to reconstruct the missing days. They imagined what they might have done. Conversations returned again and again to the same point, as if repetition might restore what was lost. The mind searches for continuity when it feels threatened, and continuity had been severed. Some tried to cope by rationalizing. They told themselves that nothing physical had changed, that they were still alive, still breathing, still present, but presence without continuity feels hollow. A life is not just a series of moments. It is a sequence. Break the sequence and meaning phrase. Others became angry. They blamed leaders, reformers, outsiders, anyone who could be held responsible. Blame provided direction for fear. It made anxiety actionable. But no amount of blame restored the missing days. And that was the most unsettling part. Time, once lost, could not be recovered. No apology could bring it back. No protest could reclaim it. No explanation could soften its absence. The days were gone. This realization marked a turning point. People began to understand that something fundamental had changed in their relationship with time. Before, time had felt natural, unquestionable, something that simply happened. Now it felt imposed, and imposed things invite resistance. Some refused to update their calendars. They kept the old dates visible, even when new ones were distributed. Others marked both, creating layered time in their homes. Old time and new time coexisted uneasily. This duality was exhausting. Every plan required negotiation. Every appointment required clarification. Every obligation carried the risk of misunderstanding. Life slowed, not because people wanted it to, but because certainty had disappeared. Children sensed the tension. They grew restless, confused. Adults struggled to reassure them because adults no longer felt reassured themselves. The sense of safety that comes from predictable time had vanished. In its place was vigilance. People watched for further changes, further corrections, further losses. They learned something dangerous that day. That time could be altered without their consent, and once that lesson is learned, trust never fully returns. The missing days were not just an anomaly. They were proof that the framework holding life together was more fragile than anyone had believed. And as this proof settled into collective memory, it began to change behavior. People became more cautious, more skeptical, less willing to accept explanations at face value, less willing to assume that systems existed for their benefit. Time, which had once unified society, had become a source of division. And this division did not fade. It deepened, because the next step was not confusion. It was enforcement. Calendars would not simply change. They would be imposed. And in the next chapter, we will see what happens when authority demands obedience to a new reality. Not gradually, not gently, but all at once. Because the real conflict was only beginning. When calendars changed overnight, the real rupture did not come when people learned that days were missing. It came when they realized the change was permanent. What began as confusion hardened into confrontation the moment new calendars appeared everywhere. They were nailed to public buildings, hung in churches, distributed to merchants, stamped onto official records. Old dates were crossed out, new ones printed boldly without apology. There would be no return. Authorities made this clear. The calendar was not a suggestion. It was the law. All contracts, obligations, and records would now follow the revised time. Anyone refusing to comply would be treated as out of step with reality itself. For many, this was the moment disbelief turned into anger. Because disagreement was no longer allowed, people were not invited to understand the change. They were expected to accept it, quietly, immediately, completely. The speed of enforcement unsettled everyone. There was no transitional period, no space for adaptation. One morning, yesterday existed. The next it didn't, and society moved forward as if nothing had happened. But something had. Daily life became a negotiation with uncertainty. Merchants argued over delivery dates. Customers accused sellers of cheating. Court cases stalled as lawyers disputed deadlines that no longer aligned with memory. Rent was due on days tenants insisted had never occurred. Time, once a background element, now dominated every interaction. And domination breeds resistance. Officials responded with patience at first. They held meetings, issued explanations, spoke about necessity and modernization. They used scientific language, invoking accuracy and alignment, assuming reason would dissolve emotion. It didn't, because this was not a technical problem. It was a psychological one. People were being asked to rewrite their lived experience, to accept that what they remembered as the present was now officially the past, to trust documents over memory. That request cut deeper than anyone anticipated. Memory is not just recollection, it is proof of existence. When memory is invalidated, people feel erased. Some attempted compromise. Local leaders suggested using both calendars temporarily. Old dates for tradition, new dates for administration, a bridge between realities. This solution failed almost immediately. Dual time created chaos. Missed appointments multiplied. Obligations were forgotten or disputed. Accusations of manipulation spread. People suspected others of exploiting confusion for advantage. Trust eroded further. As frustration grew, authorities hardened their stance. Compliance became mandatory. Official services were denied to those using old dates. Legal recognition required adherence to the new calendar. Public messaging emphasized unity, order, and progress. Unity felt like coercion, order felt like control, progress felt like loss. The calendar became a symbol not of time, but of power. Accepting it meant submitting to authorities' version of reality. Rejecting it became an act of defiance. Some resisted openly. They crossed out new dates. They refused to sign documents. They insisted on writing letters using the old calendar. They corrected officials in public, daring them to respond. Others resisted quietly. They complied outwardly but continued living by the old time at home. They celebrated festivals privately. They marked birthdays according to memory rather than decree. Public time and private time split. This division was exhausting. Living in two realities requires constant vigilance. One mistake could mean punishment. One slip could reveal non-compliance. People learned to speak carefully, to calculate which time to use with whom. Children learned this skill quickly. They became bilingual in time. One calendar at home, another at school. One truth with family, another with authority. This fractured identity, people no longer experienced time as shared. It became contextual, conditional, political. Religious institutions were forced into painful decisions. Some aligned fully with the new calendar. prioritizing unity with authority. Others refused, insisting sacred time could not be dictated by decree. Congregations split. Families attended different services. Holidays were observed on different days. Arguments broke out over which observance was legitimate. Faith, once a source of stability, became another arena of conflict. Authorities underestimated the emotional cost of enforcement. They treated resistance as ignorance rather than grief. They assumed compliance would restore order. It did not. Compliance bred resentment. People followed the new calendar because they had to, not because they believed in it. This distinction mattered. Obedience without belief creates tension. It forces people to perform agreement while privately rejecting it. Performance drains energy. Over time, outrage gave way to exhaustion. People stopped arguing not because they were convinced, but because resistance was costly. Fines were imposed, services withheld, social standing threatened. Survival required adaptation. But adaptation did not erase memory. Stories of the missing days persisted. They were told quietly, passed down as warnings. Remember when they took time from us. Remember how fast it happened. These stories became part of identity. They preserved a sense of injustice that official narratives ignored. The calendar reform was recorded in history as rational progress, as modernization, as alignment with objective truth. But lived experience told a different story. It told of disorientation, of loss, of coercion disguised as necessity. People learned a lesson that extended far beyond dates. Reality could be imposed, and once imposed, it demanded performance. This realization changed how people viewed authority. Declarations felt less trustworthy, reforms felt more suspicious. Progress felt conditional. Time had taught them to doubt. As weeks turned into months, society adjusted. New routines formed, new habits solidified. Children born after the change learned only the revised time. For them, nothing was missing. But for those who lived through the shift, something never fully settled. A lingering sense that the present could be rewritten at any moment. That the rules defining reality were not fixed. That continuity was granted, not guaranteed. This awareness did not fade with familiarity, it sharpened. Because while people were adapting, something else was happening quietly. Not everyone accepted the new time. Some communities went further than quiet resistance. They refused entirely. They chose to live in a different time altogether. And in doing so, they exposed just how fragile the agreement holding society together really was. Because when people stop agreeing on what day it is, society does not merely slow down, it fractures. And in the next chapter, we will enter those fractures. Into the villages that chose memory over decree, and into the consequences of living outside official time. The villages that refused the new time. For some communities, compliance was never truly considered. While cities struggled to adjust and institutions enforced the new calendar with increasing authority, there were places where the announcement simply did not take root. Villages tucked away from administrative centers, bound more tightly by tradition than by paperwork, reacted not with outrage or protest, but with quiet refusal. They did not march. They did not petition. They did not argue publicly. They continued living as if nothing had changed. In these villages, the sun still rose the same way it always had. Fields were planted when memory said it was time. Festivals were celebrated when they had always been celebrated. Children learned the calendar not from paper but from repetition, from elders, from habit. To outsiders, this looked like ignorance. To those inside, it felt like preservation. Time in these communities was not an abstract system. It was lived, it was embodied. It existed in stories, songs, rituals, and seasonal rhythms that had been passed down for generations. Accepting the new calendar would not simply mean changing dates. It would mean breaking continuity with ancestors. And breaking continuity felt like losing identity, so they refused. At first, the consequences were subtle. Messengers arrived on the wrong days. Officials missed appointments. Letters referenced dates no one recognized. Confusion followed every interaction with the outside world. But within the villages there was calm. People knew what day it was, not because a document told them, but because they remembered. Memory replaced measurement. This reliance on memory strengthened internal bonds. Elders gained renewed importance as keepers of time. Their recollections carried authority that paper could not match. Time became communal again, shared and reinforced through collective agreement. But shared agreement within a village did not translate beyond it. Trade became difficult. Merchants arrived too early or too late. Deliveries failed. Markets were missed. Economic pressure began to build. Families felt the strain as well. Relatives living in cities followed the new calendar. Visits were planned on incompatible days. Birthdays were celebrated twice or not at all. Weddings required negotiation across temporal boundaries. Which date was real? The question stopped being theoretical. It became personal. Children growing up in these villages learned quickly that time was political. They learned which calendar to use at home and which to reference when leaving the village. They learned that dates could betray you, that saying the wrong one in the wrong place could bring trouble. They became fluent in contradiction. This fluency came at a cost. Living in two times required constant awareness. A mistake could invite ridicule, punishment, or exclusion. Children carried this tension into adulthood, shaping how they navigated the wider world. For them, time was never innocent. Authorities tolerated this resistance at first. These villages were small, remote, easy to ignore, but tolerance faded as the implications became clear. Fragmented time undermined governance. Records became unreliable. Legal enforcement became inconsistent. Pressure increased. Officials returned with persuasion. They explained the necessity of uniform time. They spoke of modernization and efficiency. They framed compliance as progress, but progress meant erasure. Villagers listened politely and continued as before. When persuasion failed, pressure escalated. Services were withheld. Legal recognition was denied. Those who refused the new calendar found themselves excluded from official systems. Their births went unrecorded. Their marriages unrecognized. Their land claims questioned. Time became a gatekeeper, and gates exclude. This exclusion hardened resolve. People who might have compromised now felt attacked. Accepting the new calendar under pressure felt like surrender. Refusal became symbolic, not just practical. Old time was no longer merely habit. It was defiance. Stories began to circulate within these communities. Stories of endurance, of standing firm, of honoring ancestors by refusing to forget their rhythms. These narratives strengthened identity. They framed resistance as moral rather than stubborn. And morality is powerful. Villages became symbols even if unintentionally. Outsiders whispered about them. Some admired their resolve, others mocked their backwardness. Authorities saw inconvenience, but few understood what was truly at stake. Time is not just a tool for coordination, it is a foundation for meaning. By refusing the new calendar, these communities were asserting that meaning could not be dictated. That lived experience mattered more than imposed structure. This assertion carried risk. Economic isolation deepened. Younger generations felt torn. Some left, seeking opportunity and acceptance in the wider world. Others stayed, choosing belonging over access. Those who left experienced disorientation. They entered cities where their sense of time was invalid, where their age was recalculated, where their memories were considered incorrect. They felt as if they had stepped sideways into a parallel reality. Nothing was visibly wrong, but nothing aligned. Days felt mispaced. Social cues were off. Life seemed to move either too quickly or not quickly enough. Many struggled to adapt. Some returned home. Others stayed, carrying quiet resentment. Those who remained in the villages experienced a different tension. They watched numbers shrink, traditions strain, the future feel uncertain. But they did not regret their choice, because regret would mean admitting that time had been taken. And that was unacceptable. What these villages revealed was something deeply unsettling. Time does not exist solely in clocks and calendars. It exists in agreement. When agreement fractures, time fragments. This fragmentation exposed a truth modern societies prefer not to acknowledge. Time is a social contract. We treat it as natural because that makes it easier to obey. But beneath that obedience lies coordination, shared belief, mutual recognition. Remove those elements and time loses authority. The villagers understood this intuitively. They lived it daily. By continuing to live according to memory, they demonstrated that continuity could be sustained without official sanction. That time could be preserved through collective belief alone. But belief has limits. Pressure mounted. Isolation proved unsustainable. Economic realities intruded. Younger generations demanded access to education, work, and mobility that required official time. Gradually, reluctantly, compromises were made. Some rituals were rescheduled, some dates adjusted. Some elders conceded quietly, not because they believed the new calendar was right, but because survival demanded adaptation. Old time receded, not abruptly, not completely. It faded into memory, but memory endured. Stories of refusal were passed down. Children learned about the days that had been taken, about the time their grandparents chose not to surrender. These stories became part of identity, shaping how new generations understood authority and change. History would later reduce these villages to footnotes, examples of resistance to progress, curiosities. But their significance runs deeper. They showed that time only works when people believe in it, and belief can be withdrawn. This withdrawal does not destroy time. It reveals its fragility. As these communities slowly reintegrated, the damage had already been done. The idea that time was absolute could not be restored. People everywhere had seen that disagreement over time could fracture society, and that realization did not stay contained. It spread. Because while some resisted collectively, others began to struggle individually. Living in contested time did not just affect schedules, it affected minds. And in the next chapter, we will step inside that internal fracture, into the psychological cost of living without temporal certainty. Because when time stops feeling reliable, the mind searches desperately for something else to hold on to. And sometimes, it cannot find it. What happens when time loses meaning? The fracture that appeared in villages and institutions soon revealed itself in a quieter, more intimate place, inside the human mind. At first, the symptoms were subtle. People complained of fatigue without cause. Sleep became uneven. Some woke too early, convinced they were late. Others slept through alarms, disoriented, unsure whether the day had already begun. Time, once a background rhythm, now demanded constant attention. When the calendar no longer felt trustworthy, the body lost its cues. Days blurred together, weeks lost shape. People struggled to remember whether something had happened yesterday or several days ago. Memory, which relies on sequence, faltered when sequence itself became uncertain. Doctors noticed the change before anyone else did. Patients reported anxiety without clear triggers. A persistent sense of being out of sync. A feeling that life was moving either too fast or not fast enough. Some described it as standing still while the world rushed past. Others felt dragged forward against their will. The common thread was disorientation. Humans are temporal creatures. We understand ourselves through before and after. Childhood, adulthood, old age. Past mistakes. Future plans. When time loses coherence, identity weakens. People began asking questions they had never needed to ask before. How old am I really? Am I behind in life? Did I miss something important? These questions had no stable answers, and uncertainty prolonged becomes anxiety. Some people responded by tightening control. They became obsessed with schedules. They tracked hours meticulously. They counted steps, meals, tasks. They attempted to impose order on a system that felt hostile. This control offered temporary relief. But it was exhausting, because no amount of precision could restore trust in time itself. Others reacted differently. They disengaged. If time could not be trusted, why plan at all? Why hope? Why strive? These individuals drifted through days without urgency. Motivation eroded. The future lost meaning. This detachment worried families more than anger ever had. Anger still implies engagement. Detachment suggests surrender. Workplaces felt the change quickly. Productivity dropped. Absenteeism rose. Deadlines were missed not out of rebellion but confusion. People showed up early or late, unsure which time applied. Mistakes multiplied. Managers responded with stricter enforcement. Clearer rules, sharper penalties. They believed discipline would restore order. Instead, pressure intensified distress. Employees began to associate time with punishment. The clock became an adversary. Each tick felt accusatory. Each delay felt like failure. Shame crept in. Shame is powerful. It convinces people that systemic instability is personal inadequacy. Those who struggled blamed themselves. They felt weak for not adapting faster. They felt broken for reacting emotionally to what was described as a simple adjustment. They did not realize they were grieving. Grief for lost continuity. Grief for stolen anticipation. Grief for a future that no longer felt reliable. But grief was never acknowledged. There were no rituals for mourning time. So grief turned inward. Families felt strain. Arguments erupted over trivial things. A missed meal, a forgotten appointment, a disagreement over which day something happened. Each conflict reopened the wound. Children absorbed this tension silently. They learned that time was something adults argued about. Something fragile. Something dangerous. They learned not to ask too many questions. School became particularly difficult. Education relies heavily on temporal structure. Timetables, progression, advancement. When students lost confidence in time, learning suffered, concentration declined, memory weakened, teachers grew frustrated. They interpreted confusion as laziness, lack of focus as defiance. Few recognized that students were struggling with something deeper than discipline. The future felt unstable, and without a believable future, effort loses purpose. Some turned to religion for answers. They sought reassurance that time still had meaning beyond human control. Clergy offered comfort but often disagreed among themselves. Some emphasized faith over schedule. Others urged obedience to restore unity. Conflicting messages deepened confusion. Others turned to philosophy, whether they knew it or not. They questioned assumptions they had never questioned before. Is time real? Is it constructed? Does meaning exist independently of sequence? These questions did not bring immediate comfort, but they shifted perspective. Not everyone could endure this shift. Mental health crises increased. Depression became more visible. Suicides rose quietly, often attributed to personal problems rather than collective instability. The connection between temporal disruption and psychological distress went largely unrecognized. Society preferred simpler explanations. Admit the problem and authority would be questioned. So the problem was reframed as individual weakness. Those who adapted quickly were praised. They became examples. Proof that adjustment was possible. Those who struggled were ignored or blamed. This division created resentment. People compared themselves constantly. Am I behind? Am I failing? Am I wasting time? Time once neutral became moral. Good people used it well. Bad people wasted it. This belief was dangerous because it punished vulnerability. It discouraged honesty. People hid their confusion. They pretended to understand. They nodded in meetings. They laughed at jokes about lost days. They smiled while feeling unmoored. Performance replaced authenticity. Over time, exhaustion spread. Living without temporal trust requires constant effort. Every decision must be recalculated, every plan second-guessed, every expectation managed. Life felt heavier. And yet, something unexpected emerged from this strain. Some people began to slow down intentionally, not because they were confused, but because they refused to be rushed by something they no longer trusted. They stopped obsessing over productivity. They prioritized rest, conversation, presence. They measured days not by output, but by experience. This was not common, but it mattered. It represented a quiet rebellion against a broken system. These individuals were not rejecting time entirely. They were redefining their relationship to it. Instead of treating time as authority, they treated it as context, something to live within, not obey. This shift did not solve anxiety overnight, but it offered relief. It allowed people to reclaim agency, to choose meaning rather than chase it. This approach spread slowly, quietly. Through observation rather than instruction, people noticed that those who stopped fighting time seemed calmer, more grounded, less afraid. This mindset took root. It exposed a critical truth. The problem was not that time had changed. The problem was that people had been taught to rely on it for meaning. When that reliance failed, the mind struggled. But when meaning was relocated elsewhere, stability returned, not fully, not permanently, but enough. The psychological crisis revealed that time had been carrying too much weight. It had been asked to provide identity, purpose, and validation. And time is not built for that. As awareness grew, society stood at a crossroads. One path led toward tighter control, more schedules, more enforcement, more discipline. The other led toward adaptation, flexibility, redefinition. Which path would dominate remained uncertain. But one thing was clear. The damage caused by broken time was not just social. It was deeply personal. And it would shape how people responded to authority, meaning, and control in the years to come. Because once the mind learns that time is unstable, it never experiences it the same way again. And in the next chapter, we will see how those in power responded to this vulnerability, how instability was transformed into a tool, and how time itself became a mechanism of control. When time became a tool of control, what began as instability did not remain accidental for long. Those in positions of power were watching carefully. They noticed the anxiety, the confusion, the exhaustion. They saw how easily people could be unsettled when the rhythm of life lost coherence. And where vulnerability appears, control often follows. Time, once shaken, became an opportunity. The language changed first. Officials stopped talking about correction and began speaking about discipline, about efficiency, about recovery. They framed the calendar not as a burden but as a solution, a way to restore order, to protect society from chaos. People already tired wanted relief. And relief often comes packaged with obedience. Work schedules were tightened, shifts became longer, breaks shorter, deadlines more precise. These changes were justified as necessary adjustments to the new temporal order, to make up for lost time, to regain momentum. The phrase lost time appeared everywhere. It carried moral weight. Time was no longer something that happened. It was something owed. Workers felt this immediately. Expectations increased without discussion. Productivity targets were raised. Falling behind was treated not as a consequence of disruption, but as personal failure. Managers spoke in calm voices. They referenced charts and projections. They insisted the demands were reasonable, but reasonable to whom? People who were still struggling to understand what day it was were now expected to perform as if nothing had happened, to adapt instantly. To compensate for disruption they did not cause, time became a debt, and debt disciplines behavior. Rest days lost meaning. They were reframed as inefficiencies. Time off became something to justify, something to earn. People felt guilty for pausing, even when exhausted. The calendar stopped being a tool for coordination. It became a tool for judgment. Those who adapted quickly were praised, held up as examples, proof that the system worked. Those who struggled were labeled unmotivated, resistant, weak. This labeling mattered. It divided society quietly without conflict. People compared themselves constantly. Am I using my time well? Am I falling behind? Am I wasting something valuable? Time became moral. Good citizens were punctual, efficient, busy. Bad citizens were slow, disorganized, late. This binary simplified control because moral pressure enforces itself. Institutions expanded this logic beyond work. Schools adjusted schedules to maximize output. Lessons were compressed, breaks shortened. Students were encouraged to move faster, learn more, waste less time. Children absorbed this language early. They learned that time was something to conquer, something to master. Failure to keep up became a source of shame. Healthcare followed. Appointments were shortened. Efficiency metrics introduced. Patients felt rushed. Doctors were evaluated by throughput rather than care. Healing became secondary to scheduling. The irony was painful. A system created to restore order produced more stress. But stress is productive. Stressed people comply. Stressed people do not question. Stressed people are too busy surviving to resist. Time, now standardized and enforced, became invisible again, but not neutral. Its presence was felt in every interaction, in every deadline, in every late arrival. The clock became omnipresent, silently measuring worth. People internalized this measurement. They no longer needed to be reminded. They policed themselves. Waking earlier, sleeping less, apologizing for delays, feeling guilty for resting, measuring their value in hours used. The most effective form of control does not require force. It requires belief. And belief had been restored. Not belief in time as natural, but belief in time as obligation. This shift was subtle. It did not announce itself. There were no declarations, no visible chains, only schedules. And schedules are easier to accept than commands. Those who questioned this arrangement were marginalized, their concerns dismissed as nostalgia or inefficiency. They were told they were resisting progress, that they did not understand the necessity of modern life. Progress became a shield. It protected authority from critique. Because questioning time now meant questioning order itself. The calendar, once contested, became untouchable again. But something had changed. People obeyed it differently. Not with trust, with fear. Fear of falling behind, fear of being judged, fear of becoming irrelevant. Time did not need to be loved, it needed to be feared. This fear reshaped behavior deeply. Social interactions became transactional. Conversations rushed. Presence sacrificed for productivity. People apologized for taking time, as if time belonged to someone else, which in practice it did. Those who controlled schedules controlled lives. They decided when people woke, when they worked, when they rested, when they ate, when they could afford to stop. Time was no longer a shared resource. It was allocated, unequally. Those at the top enjoyed flexibility. They could delay meetings, take breaks, travel. Those at the bottom were bound tightly to schedules, late arrivals punished, deviations noted. Time became a marker of status. Having time meant having power. Lacking time meant lacking control. This inequality was rarely acknowledged. It was normalized. Because normalization hides injustice. People blamed themselves for exhaustion, for burnout, for failing to keep up. They did not see that the system was designed to extract time relentlessly. And because time extraction feels abstract, resistance felt pointless. How do you protest a schedule? How do you fight a calendar? So most people adapted. They learned to live with less sleep, less rest, less presence. They told themselves it was temporary, that once stability returned, life would slow down again. It didn't. Acceleration became permanent. The broken time of the past was replaced with disciplined time of the present. Order was restored, but at a cost. People felt emptier, more anxious, more disconnected. They moved faster but felt less alive. They achieved more but enjoyed less. Time once feared for being unstable was now feared for never stopping. This realization lingered beneath the surface, and some began to notice. They noticed that the calendar no longer served human needs. It served systems. They noticed that efficiency was prioritized over meaning, speed over care, output over well-being. These observations did not immediately produce change. But they planted seeds, seeds of skepticism, seeds of resistance, seeds of remembrance, because some still remembered the days that were taken, and they remembered how easily time had been rewritten. That memory mattered. It reminded them that time was not inevitable, that it could be shaped. And if it could be shaped to control, it could also be reshaped to serve. This realization marked the beginning of a shift, not yet widespread, not yet visible, but growing. And in the next chapter, we will step back and look at history itself. Because the use of time as control was not new. It had always been there, hidden in bells, clocks, schedules, and routines. The broken time event did not invent control, it revealed it. How time has always been shaped by power. Once people began to see time as something that could be used against them, a disturbing realization followed. This was not new. The shock of broken time had made the structure visible, but the structure itself had existed for centuries. The calendar reform did not invent temporal control. It merely exposed a mechanism that had always been operating quietly beneath everyday life. Time had never been neutral. Long before clocks hung in every public space, bells governed communities. Church bells rang not only to mark prayer, but to organize labor. They told people when to wake, when to work, when to rest, when to gather. The sound of the bell carried authority. It disciplined bodies without force. You did not question the bell. You obeyed it. As societies grew more complex, bells became clocks. Clocks became schedules. Schedules became systems. Each evolution refined control, making it more precise, less visible, and harder to resist. The industrial age perfected this discipline. Factories required synchronization. Machines did not wait. Workers were trained to move in unison, to repeat tasks according to rhythm rather than need. Time became segmented, measured, priced. An hour had value, a minute had cost, lateness became moral failure, punctuality became virtue. This moralization of time changed how people saw themselves. A good worker was not just skilled, but timely. A responsible person did not merely act, but acted on schedule. Time became a measure of character. Children were trained early. Schools introduced timetables, bells, periods, and deadlines. Students learned to raise their hands, wait their turn, begin and stop activities on command. Learning was divided into units, each constrained by time rather than curiosity. This was not accidental. Schools prepared children for timed labor. They taught obedience to rhythm before obedience to authority. By the time students entered adulthood, the discipline felt natural. Few questioned why life had to be organized this way. It simply was. Time became invisible again, and invisible systems are the hardest to challenge. The calendar reform shattered that invisibility briefly. It reminded people that time was constructed, that someone decided how days were counted, that alignment was chosen, not inevitable. But once the initial shock faded, systems moved quickly to restore obedience. Not by force, by familiarity. Schedules returned, deadlines multiplied. Life resumed its paced march forward. People slipped back into routine because routine felt safer than uncertainty. This return did not mean forgetting. It meant accommodating. The most powerful systems do not erase doubt. They absorb it. People remembered that time could be manipulated, but they also remembered how uncomfortable instability felt. Faced with a choice between questioning time and enduring anxiety, most chose acceptance. This acceptance was not enthusiastic, it was pragmatic. Resistance takes energy. Energy was already scarce. Those who continued questioning time were often dismissed as impractical. Dreamers, idealists, people who did not understand how the world worked. The phrase, "that's just how time works," ended many conversations. It carried finality, it shut down inquiry, and it protected the system. But cracks remained. People noticed contradictions they had previously ignored. Why some people seemed to have endless time while others never had enough. Why deadlines were flexible for the powerful but rigid for everyone else. Why waiting was expected of some but intolerable for others. These observations accumulated quietly. Time began to look less like a universal rule and more like a hierarchy. Those at the top owned their time. Those below rented it. This hierarchy was rarely acknowledged explicitly, but it shaped daily life. Long hours were praised as dedication. Short breaks were treated as privilege. Leisure was framed as reward rather than right. Even rest became conditional. You rested because you earned it. You slept because you were exhausted, not because you deserved care. The calendar reform, though traumatic, had briefly disrupted this hierarchy. It had forced people to confront the artificial nature of temporal order, but the system reasserted itself quickly, refining its methods. Time discipline became more psychological. People internalized schedules so deeply that enforcement was no longer necessary. They felt guilty when resting, anxious when idle, uncomfortable without deadlines. Time colonized thought. Even leisure was scheduled, vacations planned months in advance. Relaxation measured. Productivity apps tracked time use, turning self-surveillance into habit. People monitored themselves more closely than any authority ever could. This self-policing was efficient, it reduced resistance, and it disguised control as self-improvement. The language of optimization replaced the language of obedience. People were encouraged to use time wisely, maximize productivity, eliminate waste. These phrases sounded empowering, but empowerment requires choice, and choice requires alternatives. Few alternatives existed. The idea of living outside structured time seemed unrealistic, dangerous, even irresponsible. Society framed temporal conformity as maturity. Those who refused were marginalized. The villagers who had once lived by memory were now seen as relics. Their resistance romanticized or dismissed, rarely understood. Yet their example lingered. It demonstrated that time could be lived differently, not easily, not comfortably, but differently. This possibility unsettled the system more than open rebellion ever could. Because rebellion confronts authority directly. Alternative living undermines it quietly. The memory of broken time preserved this possibility. It reminded people that the current order was not inevitable, that it had been negotiated, that it could be renegotiated. This reminder did not immediately spark change, but it altered perception. People began to notice how often urgency was manufactured, how deadlines served interests beyond necessity, how speed benefited systems more than individuals. Some slowed down deliberately, not in protest but in self-preservation. They declined overtime. They protected rest. They prioritized relationships over output. These choices were small, but small choices accumulate. They challenged the assumption that faster was always better, that busier was always more valuable, that time belonged to productivity. This shift was uneven and fragile. Many could not afford it. Economic pressure forced compliance. Survival required obedience to schedule. But the idea existed, and ideas once formed persist. The history of time control revealed something fundamental. Time discipline was never about accuracy, it was coordination. And coordination serves power. Once people understood this, time could no longer be seen as innocent. It was a tool, a sophisticated one, effective precisely because it felt natural. The day people believed time was broken had stripped away that naturalness. Even as routines returned, the memory remained, and memory changes behavior. As this awareness spread quietly, it created tension. Between those who embraced speed and those who resisted it, between systems that demanded constant acceleration and individuals who felt themselves burning out. This tension would not resolve easily, because the system had momentum. But momentum is not destiny. It can be redirected. And in the next chapter, we will see what happens when this awareness turns inward. When people stop asking how time controls them and start asking what they truly miss. Because after discipline comes longing, and longing reshapes history in unpredictable ways. Longing for a past that never existed. When people grow tired of acceleration, they do not always imagine a different future. Often they imagine a different past. As life became increasingly governed by schedules, deadlines, and invisible pressure, many found themselves looking backward not to remember accurately but to escape emotionally. The present felt rushed, fragmented, unforgiving. The future felt demanding, always asking for more. The past, by contrast, felt gentle, or at least it was remembered that way. People began speaking about earlier times with reverence. They described days that felt longer, seasons that unfolded slowly, lives that were not constantly measured, evaluated, and optimized. They spoke of evenings spent without clocks, of work that ended when the sun set, of rest that did not require justification. These memories spread quietly, shared in conversations, stories, and private reflections. They were rarely precise, details blurred, hardships faded. What remained was a feeling, stability. This feeling mattered more than accuracy. Nostalgia does not reconstruct history. It reconstructs comfort. In this imagined past, time belonged to people rather than systems. Days were shaped by need rather than efficiency. Life felt anchored to rhythms that made sense intuitively, not imposed abstractly. The appeal of this vision grew as the present felt increasingly detached from human scale. People were exhausted. Burnout was common. Anxiety normalized. Even leisure felt hurried, squeezed between obligations. The idea that life had once been slower offered relief. It suggested that acceleration was not inevitable, that the current pace was not natural, that something had been lost. But what had been lost was not always what people believed. The past they longed for was selective. It filtered out inequality, and exclusion. It remembered community but forgot constraint. It remembered simplicity but forgot scarcity. Still, the emotional truth of nostalgia remained powerful. It gave people permission to criticize the present without fully understanding the past. This criticism took many forms. Some revived old rituals. They celebrated traditional festivals, followed ancestral calendars privately, marked seasons according to memory rather than official dates. These acts were small, personal, often invisible to authority, but they mattered. They provided anchors in a world that felt temporally unmoored. Others went further, turning nostalgia into identity. They adopted traditional clothing, spoke about old values, organized life around ideals drawn from imagined history. Slowness became virtue, simplicity became resistance. This movement was not unified. It appeared differently in different places. Some framed it as cultural preservation, others as moral correction, still others as spiritual return, but all shared a common impulse: to reclaim time, to feel at home in it again. This impulse shaped politics as well. Leaders learned quickly that nostalgia was persuasive. Promises to return to better times resonated deeply. Calls to restore tradition offered comfort in an unstable present. The idea of going back felt safer than the uncertainty of moving forward. Time became ideological. Different groups imagined different pasts worth restoring. Some emphasized religious time, others national history, others agrarian rhythms. Each vision excluded others. Competing nostalgias collided. Conflict followed. Because the past, unlike the present, cannot negotiate, it cannot adapt. It exists only in interpretation, and interpretation reflects desire. What was rarely acknowledged was that the longing itself revealed something important. People did not want the past. They wanted relief. They wanted continuity. They wanted to feel that life unfolded at a pace their minds and bodies could endure. Nostalgia was a symptom, not a solution. It softened the emotional impact of acceleration. But it could not resolve the underlying tension. Still, it offered something valuable. It reminded people that time could feel different, that the current order was not the only possible one. This reminder mattered. It opened imagination. Some began questioning not just the pace of life, but the values driving it. Why was speed equated with success? Why was productivity treated as moral? Why was rest considered indulgent? These questions did not have immediate answers. But asking them shifted perspective. Art reflected this shift. Writers, painters, and musicians turned toward themes of memory, slowness, and loss. They explored time not as progress but as experience, not as measurement but as meaning. Their work resonated because it articulated something many felt but could not express. A sense that life was being outrun, that meaning was being sacrificed to efficiency. That time was no longer lived but consumed philosophy, resurfaced in popular conversation. Ideas about impermanence, mortality, and the illusion of control gained traction. People revisited ancient teachings that emphasized presence over planning, acceptance over ambition. These ideas offered comfort, but also challenge. They suggested that the problem was not only external, it was internal. People had learned to seek validation through time, through achievement measured by age, through progress defined by milestones, through worth assessed by speed. Broken time had exposed the fragility of these measures. Nostalgia allowed people to step back, but only briefly. It could not sustain long-term change. The past, imagined or real, could not support modern complexity. Eventually, some recognized this. They noticed that longing for a past that never existed distracted from the present they were actually living. That idealizing history did not address exhaustion. It merely romanticized escape. This realization was sobering. It required letting go of comfort, but it also created space. Space to ask different questions, Not how to return, but how to live now. Not how to restore old rhythms, but how to create humane ones. This shift was subtle. It did not announce itself loudly. It occurred in small decisions, choosing presence over productivity, choosing depth over speed, choosing relationships over schedules. These choices did not dismantle systems, but they changed experience. They allowed people to inhabit time differently, even within existing constraints. Not everyone could make these choices. Economic pressure remained real. Survival still demanded compliance for many, but the idea that time could be lived differently persisted. It circulated quietly, through stories, through art, through personal example. The longing for a past that never existed had served its purpose. It revealed dissatisfaction, it exposed loss, but it could not be the destination because the past was not waiting. The present was, and the present demanded something more difficult than nostalgia. It demanded responsibility. Responsibility to create meaning without relying on illusion. Responsibility to accept uncertainty without retreat. Responsibility to live with broken time without being broken by it. This realization marked another turning point. People were no longer asking time to return to what it was. They were asking what could exist beyond it. And in the next chapter, we will follow those who stopped searching backward and began searching elsewhere. Those who sought meaning not in clocks or calendars, but in something far more fragile: human presence. Searching for meaning beyond the clock. At some point, exhaustion reached a quiet threshold. People stopped asking time to save them. After nostalgia faded and acceleration proved unbearable, a smaller group began to recognize something unsettling but liberating. Time had never truly provided meaning. It had only organized it. Structure had been mistaken for purpose, sequence mistaken for value. And once that confusion was exposed, the search moved elsewhere. It did not happen dramatically. There were no declarations, no movements, no manifestos, just a slow redirection of attention, away from clocks, away from calendars, away from constant calculation, toward presence. People began noticing how often they postponed living, waiting for the right moment, the right age, the right phase, the right season. Broken time disrupted these assumptions. It made waiting feel pointless. If time could shift without warning, then permission could not be expected from it. So some people stopped asking. They acted when something felt necessary. They spoke when something mattered. They rested when they were tired, not when schedules allowed. These decisions were small, almost invisible, but deeply personal and deeply grounding. Relationships became the first anchor. When time felt unreliable, human presence offered stability. Conversations slowed. People lingered longer. They listened without watching the clock. Moments gained weight not because of duration, but because of attention. A shared meal mattered even if it happened late. A conversation mattered even if it interrupted routine. Meaning detached itself from timing. This detachment changed how people valued experiences. They stopped measuring life by milestones and began measuring it by depth. A short moment of connection outweighed hours of obligation. This shift did not simplify life, but it made it feel more honest. Ritual also returned, but in a different form. Not rituals tied to fixed dates, but practices that could be repeated whenever needed. Lighting candles, telling stories, walking without destination, sitting in silence. These rituals did not require calendars. They required presence. They stabilized emotion without demanding precision. Art became another refuge. People wrote, painted, composed, not to mark time, but to process it. Creativity allowed contradiction to exist without resolution. It held grief without forcing closure. It acknowledged uncertainty without attempting control. Art did not promise answers. It offered expression. This mattered deeply. In a world obsessed with efficiency and outcome, expression became resistance. Creating something without purpose beyond meaning itself felt radical. Philosophy also resurfaced quietly. People revisited ideas about impermanence, acceptance, and the limits of control. They questioned assumptions they had inherited rather than chosen. They recognized that the desire to master time often masked fear of mortality. Broken time forced confrontation with that fear. And confrontation, while uncomfortable, brought clarity. If time was not stable, then clinging to it was futile. Meaning had to be constructed deliberately, independent of schedule or expectation. This realization changed behavior. People became selective. They chose commitments carefully. They declined obligations that existed only to fill time. They prioritized relationships over productivity, presence over performance. This intentionality created friction. Institutions built on automatic participation struggled. Attendance declined. Engagement deepened in fewer places. People stopped showing up out of habit and began showing up out of choice. This unsettled systems accustomed to compliance, but empowered individuals. Of course, not everyone experienced this shift as liberation. For some, the loss of temporal structure intensified anxiety. They needed schedules to feel safe. Predictability provided comfort. Broken time threatened that safety. This difference revealed an important truth. There is no universal relationship to time. Some find freedom in fluidity. Others find security in structure. Acknowledging this diversity complicated the narrative. It challenged the assumption that one rhythm fits all. It demanded flexibility. Some communities responded with empathy. They adjusted expectations, allowed variation. Recognized that rigidity harmed some while supporting others. Time accommodations emerged slowly, not perfectly, but intentionally. Grief also changed. People realized that grief does not follow schedules, that healing cannot be rushed, that loss does not resolve on time. Broken time made this visible. Mourning was allowed to exist without deadlines. This was a quiet cultural shift. It softened interactions. It reduced judgment. In this way, broken time paradoxically deepened compassion. By removing the illusion of uniform progress, it allowed individual rhythms to surface. Life did not become easier, but it became gentler. Time lost its authority as ultimate judge. People no longer believed that being on time meant being right, or that falling behind meant failure, or that speed equaled success. These beliefs did not disappear. But they weakened, and weakness created space. Space for pause, space for refusal, space for care. In that space, new values began to form, values not anchored to clocks, but to meaning, to presence, to attention. This transformation was uneven and incomplete. Many systems resisted it. Many individuals could not afford it. Economic realities remained powerful, but the idea existed, and ideas reshape culture slowly. Broken time had not destroyed society. It had revealed vulnerability, and vulnerability invited reevaluation. People began asking questions that had once seemed impractical. What deserves my time? Who benefits from my urgency? What am I sacrificing to keep up? These questions changed priorities. Some relationships deepened, others ended. Careers shifted, lifestyles adjusted. People accepted less certainty in exchange for more authenticity. This exchange was not comfortable, but it felt necessary. As these changes unfolded, something else became clear. Time was still powerful. It still structured life. It still shaped opportunity. But it was no longer unquestioned. This awareness mattered. Because unquestioned structures shape behavior invisibly. Questioned structures invite choice. Choice restores agency, and agency restores dignity. Broken time had forced people to confront their dependence on something unstable. In doing so, it pushed them towards something more resilient. Not certainty, but presence. Not control, but care. As the story approaches its conclusion, one final question remains. If time is unstable, constructed, and vulnerable to power, then what anchors human life at all? What remains when the clock cannot be trusted? In the final chapter, we will step back and reflect on what this awareness leaves behind. What it means to live knowing that time is not solid, and how that knowledge reshapes the way we move forward, not by repairing time, but by learning to live gently within it. The quiet legacy of broken time. In the end, nothing dramatic happened. There was no final announcement, no restoration ceremony, no moment when time was officially declared whole again. Calendars remained aligned, clocks continued their steady movement. Society resumed its rhythm, outwardly stable, functional, productive. And yet, something had changed permanently. People no longer experienced time as innocent. They had seen behind it. They had lived through a moment when something they believed to be absolute revealed itself as conditional. When the steady march of days was interrupted not by nature, not by disaster, but by decision. That knowledge does not fade. It settles quietly into the background of thought, reshaping perception in subtle ways. It alters how people listen to urgency, how they interpret deadlines, how they measure worth. Life continued. Children grew. Work resumed. People aged. History recorded the calendar reform as a technical correction, a necessary alignment, a footnote in progress. But memory told a different story. Memory remembered the unease, the feeling that the ground had shifted beneath something essential. People learned that time does not exist independently of agreement. It functions because societies coordinate around it, trust it, submit to it. When that trust is shaken, even briefly, the scaffolding of reality becomes visible. And visible scaffolding cannot be unseen. This awareness altered the relationship between individuals and authority. Declarations felt less final, progress felt less neutral, change felt less inevitable. People learned to ask who benefited, who decided, who bore the cost. These questions did not always produce resistance. Often, they produced caution. People hesitated before accepting urgency. They questioned acceleration. They recognized that speed often served systems more than lives. Time was no longer assumed to be fair. This recognition did not liberate everyone. Many remained trapped in schedules they could not escape. Economic pressure demanded obedience. Survival required compliance. The reality of inequality persisted. But even among those who could not change their circumstances, perception shifted. They knew the clock was not truth. It was a tool, and tools can be questioned. This knowledge softened some judgments. People became more patient with delay, more forgiving of deviation, more aware that falling behind did not always signal failure. Sometimes it signaled resistance, or exhaustion, or simply difference. The day people believed time was broken exposed something modern societies prefer not to acknowledge. That much of what we call reality depends on shared belief. Borders exist because we agree they do. Money has value because we trust it does. Laws function because we collectively recognize their authority. Time is no different. It feels more natural because it governs everything. But its power comes from coordination, not inevitability. This is not a comforting truth, but it is an honest one because honesty invites responsibility. If time does not guarantee meaning, then meaning must be created deliberately. It must be chosen, protected, and renewed. Not through productivity, not through speed, but through care, through presence, through attention. Broken time did not destroy meaning. It revealed that meaning had been outsourced. People had relied on schedules to tell them when to live, when to celebrate, when to rest, when to feel accomplished. When those schedules faltered, the emptiness became visible, and visibility changed behavior. Some people slowed down, not out of rebellion, but out of necessity. They refused to treat urgency as virtue. They protected rest. They valued conversation. They chose depth over efficiency when they could. These choices were not grand. They were fragile. But they mattered. They represented a different relationship to time, not as master, but as context. The legacy of broken time is not chaos. It is awareness. Awareness that continuity is fragile, that certainty is constructed, that life unfolds within systems that can change without warning. This awareness carries weight. It can produce fear, or it can produce wisdom. Those who allowed it to produce wisdom learned something essential. That time does not define their worth. It never did. Worth is not measured in hours used, deadlines met, or speed maintained. It is measured in presence, in care, in how fully one inhabits moments that cannot be scheduled. Broken time taught people that the future is not guaranteed to arrive as planned, that progress is not linear, that control is often illusory. This knowledge is unsettling, but it is also freeing. It releases people from the demand to perform life perfectly on schedule. It allows them to acknowledge vulnerability without shame. It permits deviation from paths that no longer serve. The day people believed time was broken did not end the world, it ended innocence. It ended the unquestioned belief that time would always behave, always align, always carry meaning automatically. What followed was not collapse, it was adjustment. Quiet, uneven, human. Time continued, but belief changed, and belief shapes experience. Those who remembered broken time carried its imprint forward. They told stories not to frighten, but to warn, to remind others that reality is more delicate than it appears, that systems deserve scrutiny, that urgency should be questioned. Remember, they said, remember how easily time shifted. Remember how quickly certainty disappeared. Remember that life is not a schedule to be completed. It is an experience unfolding in uncertainty. This memory did not make people pessimistic. It made them careful, careful with promises, careful with demands, careful with judgment. Because when you know how fragile continuity is, you treat it gently. You do not rush it. You do not waste it. You do not surrender it blindly. The story of broken time is not ultimately about calendars. It is about trust, trust in systems, trust in authority, trust in the idea that life unfolds according to neutral rules. That trust, once broken, does not return to its original form. It matures, it becomes conditional, it becomes aware, and awareness, though heavy, is a form of freedom. If you carry one thought forward from this story, let it be this. Time does not grant permission to live. You do. The clock will continue to move whether you listen or not. The calendar will continue to turn whether it reflects your experience or not. But meaning does not come from keeping up. It comes from being present, and presence, unlike time, cannot be taken away. This is the quiet legacy of the day people believed time was broken. Not fear, not chaos, but a deeper understanding of what it means to be human in a world where even time itself cannot be fully trusted. And perhaps that understanding is the most valuable time anyone ever gained.